My name is Preston Sprinkle. I'm the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender, and we're a collaboration of pastors, theologians, and leaders who are equipping Christian leaders, churches, organizations to engage questions of faith, sexuality, and gender with theological faithfulness and courageous love. I would highly encourage parents to begin the discussion much sooner than later. The fact is our children are growing up in an environment where this conversation is happening way younger than when I had it. I mean, these were categories that I thought through when I was in high school, college, if that. But our kids, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, or even younger, are thinking through this. And they're going to go to the sources that they hear it from first. So if you're a parent who is scared to introduce categories, and I would say not just categories or issues, but people, introduce them to this conversation early on, and then they will come to you when they start having questions because you were the first one to address it. If as a parent all you're doing is backtracking or being defensive or putting out fires, you're not going to be the most trusted source that they're going to go to. And I think the parents need to be the primary source to help educate our kids in this very complex conversation. In the conversation of faith, sexuality, and gender, there are very, very few simple answers or simple questions. When I first began researching it, I thought it was going to be a really quick couple week study, and I'd figure it all out. And I realized that was several years ago, and I'm still just learning about it. And the more you study, the more people you talk to, the more things you learn about the LGBTQ conversation, the more you realize that there's layers and layers and layers and layers of complexity. This is on a relational level, layers of complexity on a relational level. As my psychologist friend told me, he deals with people wrestling with their gender identity. He says, if you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person. So you can't just read everything through the lens of one person's story or 10 people's story or 100 people's story. It's a long journey to understand just the relational component. As a biblical scholar and theologian, the theological conversation is very complex, very difficult. Doesn't mean there's not right and wrong answers, or even some clear answers to certain biblical passages. I do believe that the Bible clearly teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman. I think the more you read the Bible and the more you look into it, I think that becomes more clear. So that basic question, I think, is clear, but there's so many nuances that flow from that basic question that are very complex, dealing with issues of gender identity, gender fluidity, sexual fluidity, and on and on and on it goes. The Bible gives us a framework, but it doesn't answer all these in a real black and white question. And so I do think that, number one, we need to enter this conversation with humility. Number two, we need to come with a learning spirit. We can't come in with black and white categories, quick answers to complex questions, and think that we're going to be helpful in navigating this conversation with our children, with our friends, if you're a pastor, with the people in your congregation. If you don't understand and articulate and emphasize the complexity of this conversation, you're going to probably shortcut some really difficult conversations, and you're not going to be able to pastor your people well. The number one, if you're just entering the conversation, or you want to begin learning about it, and I would say there should be no Christian on the planet that shouldn't want to learn more about this topic. This is probably the most divisive ethical issue facing the church, maybe since slavery, maybe abortion or something. This is a very crucial conversation that affects the lives of pretty much everybody. We all need more education. So that's the first place, is to recognize we need it. The first thing you can do once you recognize that is to have a listening and learning posture. Several years ago, when I began researching the topic of homosexuality and gender identity, I started doing a lot of research, reading books, but then I said, you know what, I need to get my head out of the books, and I need to just get into the lives of real LGBTQ people. And all I did is I sat down and I just listened to their stories. And they're kind of freaked out. They're like, all right, what's your angle? I'm like, I just want to hear your story and learn. They said, you're an evangelical, what's your real angle? I'm like, no, I really do. I just want to listen and learn. The number one thing you can do as a Christian, especially if you're a conservative Christian, is to get to know LGBTQ people, listen to their stories. You're not sacrificing your convictions by simply listening to a person's story. That's the number one thing. I think some Christians are scared to say, if I listen or if I love too much, then I'm going to be sacrificing my convictions. Look, Jesus loved people like crazy. It doesn't mean he agreed with everything that they desired or believed or were doing, but listening is to love. You can't love somebody without listening first. And the number one thing Christians need to do in this conversation is to listen so that we can begin the pathway toward loving. So listening, learning, and I think just admitting or realizing that this is a very complex conversation and we do need to learn. And again, don't be scared to read various books and articles from people that you may disagree with. That's okay. Like it's okay to enter into the complexity of this conversation. I would also encourage Christians to find a source or a resource that they can trust to help guide them in this conversation. And that's where the center comes in. The Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender wants to be the church's most trusted resource for theologically faithful teaching on LGBTQ questions, but also helping to integrate a posture shift, a loving, hyper-compassionate, courageous, loving posture toward those who are wrestling with their sexuality or gender identity. We want to stand in the gap. What I mean by that is there is a whole real messy and complex conversation going on in blogs, in news outlets, from different Christian teachers. People are changing their view. You have this view, you have that view, you have psychologists saying this and theologians saying this, and this pastor over here and this church changed their view, and there's just this myriad of complexity going on. And yet then there's people, there's parents, there's pastors, there's school teachers that just want some guidance. They can't be an expert in it all. So the center wants to stand in the gap and translate and give some guidance on all that complexity going on so that parents can help lead their kids well, so that pastors can help lead their church well, so that Christian school principals can help lead their people well. Anybody who's a Christian leader needs some guidance in this complex conversation. The center wants to stand in the gap to help lead people in this conversation. We provide resources primarily targeted at leaders. So videos, podcasts, papers, books, all kinds of things, podcasts, blogs aimed specifically at leaders. But we also want to provide resources that the average person can understand. So we are finishing a small group curriculum called Grace Truth, 5 conversations every thoughtful Christian should have about faith, sexuality, and gender. And it's a 101 guide, a real practical guide for the person that says, I just don't know where to begin. This would be a perfect place to begin. It's accessible, it's understandable, it's practical, it's something you can go through in a small group. So that will be available summer 2017 from